The air atop the Mita escarpment on the island of Okinawa was thick with the acrid smell of sulfur and burning diesel in May of 1945. Artillery shells pounded the earth into a chaotic slurry of mud and blood, while machine gun fire raked across the jagged coral ridge. Amidst this cacophony of destruction stood a single man who refused to carry a rifle. Desmond Doss was a medic who had crawled into the mouth of hell armed only with his faith and a small Bible tucked into his chest pocket. While others sought cover or returned fire, he moved purposefully toward the wounded men who lay exposed in the kill zone. The stakes could not have been higher for the soldiers of the 77th Infantry Division who were pinned down by a relentless enemy force. Every step Desmond Doss took was a defiance of military logic and the instinct for self-preservation. The sheer cliff face behind them dropped hundreds of feet down to safety, but Doss remained on the plateau where death seemed certain. The lives of dozens of men hung in the balance as the American forces were ordered to retreat, leaving the wounded behind to a grim fate. To the other soldiers, Doss had been an enigma and a liability during training, but now he was their only hope. The question that had haunted him throughout his service was whether a man could serve his country without compromising his soul. He was about to answer that question not with words, but with an act of courage that would echo through history. Desmond Doss was not the first man to face the agonizing choice between duty to the state and duty to his conscience. He belonged to a lineage of individuals known as conscientious objectors who claimed a moral or religious right to refuse participation in warfare. These men and women often stood alone against the tide of public opinion and the machinery of government. They were labeled cowards and traitors and subversives by a society that equated patriotism with the willingness to kill. Yet their story is woven deep into the fabric of American history, challenging the very definition of bravery. From the Quakers of colonial Pennsylvania to the draft resistors of the Vietnam War, the conscientious objector has forced the nation to look in the mirror. The roots of this moral stance in America go back to the earliest days of the colonies, where religious freedom was a primary draw for settlers. The Society of Friends, commonly known as Quakers, established a presence in Pennsylvania and declared their testimony against war to the whole world. They believed that the Spirit of God resided in every human being making violence against another person, a direct sin against the Creator. When the American Revolutionary War erupted, these pacifists found themselves in a precarious position. They refused to pay war taxes or bear arms for the Continental Army, which led to the confiscation of their property and imprisonment. Their stubborn refusal to fight for independence was seen by many patriots as a betrayal of the nascent nation. As the United States grew and fractured, the issue of conscription brought the conflict between state and conscience into sharp relief during the American Civil War. Both the Union and the Confederacy implemented drafts to feed the insatiable hunger of the war machine. In the North, the Enrollment Act of 1863 allowed wealthy men to pay a commutation fee or hire a substitute, but it made little provision for those who objected on religious grounds. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton eventually created a provision for members of peace churches to serve in hospitals or care for freedmen. However, many young men faced brutal treatment in military camps, where officers viewed their refusal to drill as insubordination punishable by torture or execution. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it the mechanized slaughter of the Great War and a surge of fervent nationalism. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the Selective Service Act was passed to raise a massive army. The law recognized conscientious objectors, but only if they belonged to a well-recognized religious sect whose creed forbade war. This left political objectors and absolutists who refused any cooperation with the military in a dangerous legal limbo. Men like Ben Salmon, a Catholic trade unionist, argued that the commandment "Thou shalt not kill" was absolute and applied to nations as well as individuals. Salmon and others were court-martialed and sentenced to decades in prison for their defiance. Inside military prisons like Fort Leavenworth and Alcatraz, the treatment of absolutist objectors was often barbaric. They were subjected to solitary confinement and manacled to the bars of their cells for hours on end in a standing position. The Hutterite brothers named Joseph and Michael Hofer, were two such men who died after enduring harsh conditions and mistreatment for their refusal to wear a military uniform. Their bodies were returned to their families dressed in the very uniforms they had died resisting. This tragic irony highlighted the extreme lengths to which the government would go to enforce conformity. The public generally supported these measures, viewing objectors as slackers who were letting other men die in their place. Yet amidst the persecution, there were stories of complex transformation and compromise. Alvin York was a young man from the mountains of Tennessee who had a reputation for drinking and fighting before a religious conversion changed his life. When his draft notice arrived for World War I, he wrote on the card that he did not want to fight. York was a member of the Church of Christ in Christian Union and believed strictly in the Bible. He struggled immensely with the contradiction between his duty to his country and his interpretation of Scripture. His initial request for exemption was denied because his church was not a recognized peace sect. York reported for duty torn between two powerful loyalties. Alvin York engaged in long theological debates with his battalion commander Major George Edward Buxton and his company commander Captain Edward Danforth. They discussed biblical passages regarding violence and the role of the Christian in the state. Buxton cited verses where Jesus instructed his disciples to buy swords, while York countered with the Beatitudes. Eventually, York went into the mountains to pray and returned with a sense of peace, believing that God intended for him to go to war. He became one of the most decorated soldiers of the war, earning the Medal of Honor for his actions in the Argonne Forest. His story became a convenient narrative for the government, suggesting that the true patriot could reconcile faith and fighting. The interwar years saw a shift in the legal landscape as peace organizations lobbied for broader recognition of conscience. The horrific toll of the Great War had disillusioned many Americans, and pacifist sentiment grew in mainline Protestant denominations. By the time the clouds of war gathered again in the late 1930s, there was a concerted effort to prevent the abuses of the past. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 was the first peacetime draft in United States history, but it contained a broader provision for conscientious objection. It allowed for alternative service for those who could not conscientiously bear arms, expanding the definition beyond strictly sectarian lines. When the Japanese military attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the national mood shifted instantly to one of unified rage and resolve. The isolationist sentiment evaporated, and millions of young men flooded recruiting stations. For the conscientious objector, this was a time of intense testing. To refuse to fight against the forces of fascism and tyranny seemed to many to be a moral failure. Yet nearly 43,000 Americans obtained conscientious objector status during World War II. About 25,000 of them served in the military as non-combatants, often as medics or chaplain's assistants. They were willing to wear the uniform and face danger, but they would not kill. For the 12,000 objectors who refused any military service, the government established the Civilian Public Service. These men were sent to camps across the country to perform work of national importance, such as forestry and soil conservation and fire fighting. They received no pay and were often responsible for their own support, which created significant hardship for their families. These camps became incubators for the civil rights movement and future peace activism. Within these isolated communities, men from diverse backgrounds debated the nature of violence and democracy. They fought forest fires in the Pacific Northwest and served as guinea pigs in medical experiments to help humanity rather than destroy it. One of the most famous conscientious objectors of the era was the Hollywood actor Lew Ayres, who had starred in the anti-war film All Quiet on the Western Front. When Ayres declared himself an objector, the public backlash was swift and severe. Variety magazine predicted that his career was over, and theaters refused to show his films. Ayres served as a medic and chaplain aide in the Pacific Theater, assisting wounded soldiers under fire. His quiet dedication and bravery eventually won over his critics, and he returned to Hollywood after the war with his integrity intact. His journey demonstrated that the refusal to kill did not equate to a lack of courage or patriotism. This brings the narrative back to Desmond Doss and his trials before ever reaching the battlefield. During basic training at Fort Jackson in South Carolina, Doss was ostracized and bullied by the other men in his unit. They threw shoes at him while he prayed and accused him of hiding behind his religion to avoid combat. One officer attempted to have him discharged on the grounds of mental instability because he refused to touch a rifle. Doss fought the discharge, arguing that he was a conscientious cooperator, not an objector. He wanted to serve his country and save lives, but he would not take a life. He told his commanding officers that while they were taking life, he would be saving it. The legal and bureaucratic battles Doss fought were nearly as exhausting as the physical training. He was threatened with court-martial for disobeying direct orders to handle a weapon. His stubbornness was born of a promise he made to God and to himself after seeing a poster of the Ten Commandments as a child. The image of Cain killing Abel had seared into his mind, and he vowed never to commit such an act. This simple, unshakable conviction baffled his superiors, who saw war as a necessary evil, where normal moral rules were suspended. Doss eventually won the right to accompany his unit into combat without a weapon, setting the stage for his actions at Okinawa. When the 77th Infantry Division assaulted the Mita Escarpment, the fighting was brutal and close quarters. The Japanese defenders were dug into caves and tunnels, and they fought with a ferocity that stunned the Americans. As men fell by the score, Desmond Doss was everywhere at once. He applied tourniquets and administered plasma and dragged wounded men to safety amidst the explosions. He did not seek cover for himself, but stood tall to locate the injured. His uniform was soaked in the blood of his comrades, but his hands remained clean of the blood of his enemies. The men who had mocked him now cried out for him. As the order to retreat was given and the able-bodied Americans scrambled down the cargo nets to safety, Doss remained atop the ridge. He was alone with the wounded and the enemy. Under constant fire and the threat of Japanese patrols, he located the injured soldiers one by one. He dragged them to the edge of the cliff and used a rope to lower them down to the waiting hands below. For 12 hours he worked in the darkness, praying a simple prayer. "Lord, help me get one more." With each man he saved, he prayed it again. Just one more. By the time he finally came down, he had single-handedly rescued 75 men. The Medal of Honor was placed around the neck of Desmond Doss by President Harry Truman on the White House lawn. He was the first conscientious objector to receive the highest military award for valor. His story forced a reevaluation of what it meant to be a soldier. He proved that the moral stance against killing could coexist with the highest form of military virtue. However, the end of World War II and the onset of the Cold War brought new challenges. The threat of nuclear annihilation and the proxy wars against communism created a climate of fear where dissent was often equated with treason. The Vietnam War presented a radically different landscape for conscientious objection. Unlike the clear moral imperative of World War II, the conflict in Southeast Asia was murky and deeply unpopular. The draft reached into every community in America, pulling young men into a jungle war that many did not understand or support. The criteria for conscientious objection came under intense scrutiny by the Supreme Court. In the case of United States versus Seeger in 1965, the court expanded the definition of religious belief to include a sincere and meaningful belief that occupies a place in the life of its possessor parallel to that filled by the orthodox belief in God. As the war escalated, the selective service system implemented a draft lottery in 1969, which galvanized the resistance. Millions of young men watched on television as their birth dates were pulled from a glass bowl determining their fate. Opposition to the war moved from the fringes to the mainstream. University campuses erupted in protest, and thousands of young men burned their draft cards in public acts of defiance. Some fled to Canada or Sweden to avoid induction, while others chose to go to prison. The conscientious objector was no longer a solitary figure, but part of a mass movement that questioned the legitimacy of the war itself. The most visible face of this resistance was the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Muhammad Ali. Born Cassius Clay, he had converted to Islam and changed his name, declaring that he was a minister of the Nation of Islam. When he was drafted in 1966, he famously stated that he had no quarrel with the Viet Cong. Ali argued that his religion forbade him from fighting in a war that was not declared by Allah. His objection was not just religious but deeply political and racial. He pointed out the hypocrisy of a country that denied civil rights to Black Americans while demanding they fight for freedom abroad. On April 28, 1967, Muhammad Ali reported to the induction center in Houston, Texas. When his name was called to step forward and be inducted into the United States Army, he stood still. He was warned of the penalty, which was 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. His name was called again, and again he remained motionless. This act of civil disobedience sent shockwaves through American society. To the establishment, he was an ungrateful traitor who had turned his back on the country that made him rich. To the anti-war movement and Black Americans, he was a hero who spoke truth to power. The consequences for Ali were immediate and devastating. He was arrested and convicted of draft evasion. The Boxing Commission stripped him of his title and suspended his boxing license, effectively robbing him of his prime years as an athlete. He was vilified by the press and much of the white public. Yet Ali used his exile to tour college campuses and speak out against the war and racism. He became a symbol of the struggle for individual conscience against state power. His sacrifice resonated with a generation that was increasingly disillusioned with the government's narrative about Vietnam. The legal battle of Muhammad Ali reached the Supreme Court in the case of Clay versus United States in 1971. The court ruled unanimously in his favor, overturning his conviction. The justices found that the draft board had failed to specify why his application for conscientious objector status was denied. The decision was a technical one, but it was a massive moral victory. It validated the idea that a Muslim could be a conscientious objector, and that objection could be based on non-traditional religious grounds. Ali returned to the ring, but his victory outside the ropes was arguably his greatest fight. The end of the Vietnam War and the suspension of the draft in 1973 marked a turning point. The United States moved to an all-volunteer force, which changed the dynamic of conscientious objection. Without the pressure of conscription, the issue faded from the headlines, but it did not disappear. Soldiers who volunteered could still develop a conscientious objection to war after witnessing combat or undergoing a spiritual transformation. The military established procedures for discharging these personnel, but the process remained rigorous and often adversarial. The volunteer nature of the force made the claim of objection harder for some commanders to accept. During the Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s and the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the issue resurfaced. A small but significant number of service members sought discharge as conscientious objectors. Some had enlisted for economic reasons or educational benefits and found themselves morally unable to pull the trigger when deployed. Others had experienced a change of heart after seeing the reality of modern warfare. These modern objectors faced the same accusations of cowardice and betrayal as their predecessors. They were often isolated within their units and faced social stigma upon returning home. The philosophy of conscientious objection has evolved from a strictly religious framework to a broader ethical one. The Supreme Court eventually recognized that a deeply held moral or ethical belief could be just as valid as a religious one. This shift acknowledged that the conscience is not the exclusive domain of the devout. Secular humanists and philosophers have argued that the prohibition against killing is a universal human value. This broadened definition has allowed a more diverse group of individuals to claim the status, although the burden of proof remains on the individual to demonstrate sincerity. While the American experience is unique, the phenomenon is global. Nations around the world have grappled with how to accommodate those who refuse to fight. Some countries like Israel and South Korea have mandatory conscription with very limited provisions for objection, leading to the imprisonment of hundreds of young men each year. In Europe, the right to conscientious objection is recognized as a fundamental human right by the European Court of Human Rights. The recognition of this right is often seen as a marker of a mature democracy that respects the individual liberty of its citizens. The psychological toll on the conscientious objector is often overlooked. The decision to stand apart from one's peers and refuse to share the burden of defense is agonizing. Many objectors struggle with guilt, wondering if their refusal has caused others to die in their place. This is the paradox of the non-violent warrior. They are often men and women of deep empathy who feel the suffering of the world acutely. Their refusal is not an act of indifference, but an act of intense moral engagement. They carry the weight of their convictions just as soldiers carry the weight of their combat experiences. Social ostracism has been a constant companion to the objector throughout history. During World War I, women in Britain and America would hand white feathers to men not in uniform as a symbol of cowardice. This public shaming was designed to humiliate men into enlisting. Families of objectors were often targeted, their businesses boycotted, and their homes vandalized. The pressure to conform is a powerful social force, and resisting it requires a different kind of strength. It is the strength to be a pariah in one's own community for the sake of an invisible principle. The impact on the families of conscientious objectors is also profound. Wives and children often bore the brunt of community anger. In the case of the absolutists who went to prison, their families were left without a breadwinner and faced financial ruin. The shame associated with having a father or husband in prison for draft evasion could haunt a family for generations. Yet many families stood by their men, proud of their refusal to compromise. The letters exchanged between prison cells and lonely homes reveal a deep shared commitment to the ideals of peace and faith. Today, the historic peace churches like the Mennonites and Brethren and Quakers continue to uphold their testimony against war. They maintain that the way of Jesus is the way of non-violence and that this command is absolute. They work tirelessly in conflict resolution and disaster relief, often going into war zones to help the victims of violence. Their consistent witness serves as a reminder to the state that there are limits to its authority. They assert that the state may command the body, but it cannot command the soul. The legacy of the conscientious objector is a testament to the power of the individual conscience. These men and women have expanded the boundaries of religious freedom and civil liberties for all Americans. They have forced the legal system to recognize that there are moral imperatives that supersede the laws of man. Their story challenges us to consider where our own lines are drawn. It asks us what we would do if the state demanded something that violated our deepest held beliefs. Would we have the courage to say no? The paradox of freedom is that it must be defended sometimes with force, yet it is also defined by the right to refuse that defense. A free society must be strong enough to tolerate those who will not fight for it. If a democracy forces its citizens to violate their conscience, it destroys the very freedom it claims to protect. The conscientious objector stands at this intersection, holding a mirror to the state. They remind us that the true strength of a nation is not just in its military might, but in its moral character. From the bloody ridge of Okinawa to the boxing rings of the world, the conscientious objector has walked a lonely path. Desmond Doss saved 75 men without firing a shot, proving that love is stronger than death. Muhammad Ali sacrificed his crown to keep his soul, proving that principle is more valuable than popularity. These figures and thousands of unnamed others have left an indelible mark on history. They have shown that the refusal to kill is not a retreat from the world, but a brave engagement with it. As we look back on the history of warfare, we often focus on the generals and the battles and the conquests. But the history of the conscientious objector offers a different narrative. It is a narrative of the human spirit refusing to be crushed by the machinery of death. It is a whisper of sanity in a world gone mad with violence. It serves as an enduring reminder that even in the darkest times, the light of conscience can guide the way. The moral stance against fighting for one's country is ultimately a fight for the soul of humanity itself.